The first item on the agenda is House Bill 2712. It requires law enforcement agencies to adopt policies on responding to officer-involved domestic violence incidents. Representative, please.
Thank you, Chair Barker, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Carla Peluso, representative from House District 50, the great city of Gresham. As many of you know, I spent 30 years in law enforcement, the last 6 as the chief of police for Gresham. Throughout my career, I've been committed to making families and communities safer. I bring that commitment to my work in the legislature. Domestic violence has been a primary concern of mine for decades and a constant priority. House Bill 2712 concerns officer-involved domestic violence. That is, when an officer is involved in domestic violence at home, whether as a victim or a perpetrator. House Bill 2712 would require all law enforcement agencies in Oregon to have a concrete policy for responding to officer-involved domestic violence and its warning signs, and would require all officers be trained on their agency policy. It would recreate a legislative task force, including law enforcement and domestic violence advocates, that would devise a policy framework that agencies could choose to adopt. If an agency would prefer to devise their own policy, they may do so, as long as it meets minimum qualifications outlined in the bill. The bill is designed to be flexible and does not assume what will work best for individual agencies. If every law enforcement agency had a clear written policy for how to respond when officers are involved in domestic violence, every officer would know without question how to respond and would respond quickly and with consistency. I see this policy as preventative. When we identify warning signs, when we address problems from the very start, we prevent senseless violence and we prevent tragedies like the one in Gresham. This is an issue that we shouldn't be keeping quiet about. Officers need a clear policy and training so they know what to do when a colleague is involved in domestic violence. I've been encouraged by broad stakeholder interest and involvement in this legislation since its conception, especially from the law enforcement community, and remain committed to seeing all Oregon law enforcement agencies adopt officer-involved domestic violence policies in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any questions for us? Please.
Thank you. And if I missed this in the beginning of your testimony, I apologize. Thank you for that. Has there been any work, notwithstanding this bill, has there been any work with the law enforcement community to address some of these issues?
We have made attempts to work with the sheriffs and the chiefs through their lobbyists without much success.
Follow up.
Meaning they won't talk about it, or what?
They don't see it as an issue, is my opinion.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. Next, I'll call Jay Hoffmeister, Kelsey Hoffmeister, Joel Shapiro, and Jason Kafori, please.
Sure.
And you can speak in any order. Just be sure to try to remember to identify yourself for the record.
Okay. Well, thank you for hearing us.
Sure. And if you say your name, please.
Jay Hoffmeister.
Thank you.
This is my wife, Kelsey's mother, Katie. Some pictures of Katie and Vicky, the other victim here. So I have one picture of her, my daughter, Kelsey. I guess what I want to talk about today is just a couple of things in support of House Bill 2712, which apparently is dead at this point. Bad terminology. So I'll go over quickly what happened here. 2010, February 2010, the girls wanted a night out. So they all got together and went to a restaurant in Gresham. And later that night, one of the ladies' husband, Officer Braun from Clackamas County, hunted him down, found him at the restaurant in Gresham, and came in, grabbed his wife, drug her outside, shot and killed her in a parking lot, came back in, found Katie and Vicky and shot them point blank, and then went back out to the parking lot where his wife was and shot himself. So after investigation and looking into the whole case, it was found that Jeff was involved in domestic violence with family and friends. So with more investigation, we found out that Clackamas County knew of the domestic violence. In other words, at least 2 family members and 2 friends of family had called and realized that Jeff there was some domestic violence involved at the home, at the Grand home. So so more investigation uncovered that this family member and another friend who was law enforcement in a different county had called Clackamas County and identified this as domestic violence and wanted the county to do something about it. So what the county chose to do was nothing. We had, I'm losing it here.
My name is Kelsey Hoffmeister. Basically, after the investigation was done, or after the reports were made, there was an investigation done by the city of Portland, and they went back to the Clackamas County, and Clackamas County decided to do nothing about it. That's kind of the more backstory of it. If they would have done something about it, if this bill was in place, I don't think we would be here today. My mom would be alive. The other families would be alive.
So I think what we're here to tell you is more than one other law enforcement agency knew of the possible or of the abuse that Jeff was doing, was involved in. And although they suggested to the county sheriff that they do something, and in one instance, the Portland police actually called or suggested they get the district attorney of Clackamas County involved, which the sheriff's department did not, chose not to. So I think what we're saying here is, if you kind of get the story, House Bill 2712, or a officer-involved domestic violence bill, would have prevented something like this happening. And what we're here for, other than to tell our story, is to hopefully prevent something like this ever happening again. I think the efforts of Representative Peluso, when she was talking about that bill here, when I was sitting and listened to it, I think we all realized, I think, Abe, I saw you, roll your eyes a little bit. What's preventing us from passing a bill like this? Why don't we have something like this? This is a common sense bill. And I don't know what the pushback is. I don't know what the opposition has suggested to you people. But I think, this is a bill that will help agencies help themselves. Now, if there's other issues that we're not involved in, I'd surely like to hear them, and maybe through Carla Peluso's office, we could work with them. But House Bill 2712 like this was definitely something we could use to prevent something like this to happen again. And we ask your support. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kafori?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Jason Kafori. I'm an attorney at the law firm of Kafori and McDougall, and I represented the Hoffmeisters in their civil action against Clackamas County Sheriff's Department. We're not here today to badmouth the Clackamas County Sheriff's Department, even though they did an absolutely horrible job of dealing with the Jeffrey Grahn situation. We would like to take this tragedy and be able to save lives. Let's start with the problem. Domestic violence amongst police officers is 2 to 4 times higher than in the general population. I brought you an article from The Atlantic, a big in-depth article. It's higher than in the NFL. Domestic violence amongst police officers higher than amongst the National Football League. So the problem is real. We know it's documented. So the question is, what are we going to do about it as a community and society? With the state of Washington, our neighbors had a similar tragedy back in early 2000s. Chief of a police, Chief Brame, murdered his wife and then I believe murdered himself, right? And similar situation. There was evidence that they could have done something to help the chief, and they didn't. Well, you know what the state of Washington did? They didn't sit around and wait for years to do something. That very next legislative cycle, they built a coalition of groups, domestic violence groups, and they passed what is now the best bill in the entire country involving domestic violence. It is a model, in fact, for the country. They passed it in 2004. They had the governor behind it. And what that bill requires is that once an officer has an allegation of domestic violence, they must be taken off duty, surrender their firearm, and an investigation is required to be done by an outside agency. Now, in this bill that we're proposing here, we're not even coming up with the framework here. We're just trying to start the process, and we came up with the idea of having DPSST, since they certify police officers, come up with that model plan, and we'd like to work together with them to do that. But the state of Washington did it right. They created a model. This is not a problem that just exists within our region. This is a national problem. And I brought in the International Association of Police Chiefs have come up with a model bill. In fact, that's what Brame bill was based on, was what the International Association of Police Chiefs came up with. So this is a problem that police chiefs around the country understand, they want to do something about, but frankly, the police unions and their lobby is pretty strong. And that's why, you know, we started this process 2 years ago after the civil case resolved, to try to get something done here at the legislature to fix the problem. We talked to the various entities representing the police unions and the police chiefs. They had some, you know, general agreement that it's a problem, but as we've seen, nothing has changed. Still to this day, Clackamas County Sheriff's Department has not adopted a formal plan that is in writing of how to deal with allegations of domestic violence. I mean, the Grand situation happened 7 years ago, 2010, and nothing has changed. So the reality is that, and they point out a couple of the egregious facts in the Grand investigation. The one really serious thing that happened, I mean, there was a whole bunch of serious things, but the Clackamas County Sheriff's internal affairs, the head of internal affairs, met with the Portland Police to start a domestic violence allegation. The Portland Police had put together 30 pages of allegations, very detailed, from Charlotte Grand's sister and from some of the other family members. And it was, you know, I won't even go into all the details of it, but it was really ugly stuff, and it was documented. And the Portland Police told the Clackamas County Sheriff's Internal Affairs head, Phelan. They said to Phelan, what we do in Portland is we work with the district attorney while we're developing probable cause for domestic violence. And there's a memo that was written after the death where Sergeant Bonson of the Portland Police said, Phelan said not once but twice, no, don't do that here. Don't bring in the Clackamas County District Attorney. That was as big of a smoking gun as you could have, that Clackamas County Sheriff's Department was not taking these allegations seriously. And as we've learned, when you enable someone who does domestic violence, when you turn the other cheek and don't do anything about it, it ratchets up. It's the same problem we've seen over and over again throughout history. And that's what happened in this terrible tragedy, and these family members will have to live with that tragedy for the rest of their lives. What I would like to work here with the legislature on is to get some people, not just Representative Peluso, who are passionate about this, who want to help us next session. I realize we're not going to be able to get something done this session, but I think we need to put together a bigger team of people to work on this both House and Senate, to make their tragedy and all the other families that have lost loved ones something that we can prevent down the road by coming up with this model plan so that when there's an allegation of domestic violence, there are serious repercussions, and that person who's doing it, the perpetrator, knows that their police force has an outside entity that's going to investigate. I think it will save a lot of lives, and the power is obviously in your hands. As we've seen, the police chiefs around the state have not implemented model policies on their own. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
For the record, I'm Joel Shapiro. I'm going to keep this pretty brief. I'm here primarily to answer questions. I've been working with the family on this policy issue. I first started working on domestic violence in 1999 when I was a law student and came down here. My first time testifying in front of this body was that session. And we passed a law to create a hearsay exception for domestic violence, which I had crafted working with law enforcement folks and one of my law professors, Doug Balouf, and that became law, and there are now at least 10 states that have a similar law. So domestic violence policy evolves over time, and I think that officer-involved domestic violence is one of the issues where we have had an opportunity to see what works, to learn from it, and now it's time for Oregon to implement that policy. What this bill would do is look forward, and as Jay has said many times when we've come and met with folks here, and we've had a chance to meet with most of the members of the committee, this is about being proactive, not reactive. They don't have anything to gain from this bill. They've already gone through their tragedy. They want to prevent this from happening. This is not about looking backwards and pointing fingers and blaming anybody for anything that's happened. This is about how can we make Oregon a safer place for victims of domestic violence when the perpetrator has a badge and a gun and a lot of authority and knows how the system works. And, just quite frankly, it can't be voluntary. This needs to be a statewide law where every law enforcement agency has a written policy so that they can follow those protocols when an allegation occurs. It's pretty simple. This bill would set that policy-making authority with DPSST, which I think is a very reasonable and appropriate place for that to happen. So originally, there was a bill that was more prescriptive. Law enforcement said that's a problem. Representative Peluso has done just amazing work, and I really want to thank her. I should have started with that. Thank you to Representative Peluso for leading this effort, and thank you to the members of the committee for your interest in this issue. I hope we can go forward and come up with a solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Stark.
Thank you, Chair Barker. This is actually more of a question for you. I was surprised to hear law enforcement categorized as unresponsive to this bill, and
I'm going to have somebody come up and talk.
so there is, okay, thank you.
I had the same
Okay.
question, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony. And I'll call Kevin Campbell, please.
And I will leave, just for the record, there's other areas, other sections of the country, like the city of Pittsburgh and Tennessee, that have adopted some measures, so I'm going to leave those with you guys for the record.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Barker and members of the committee. I deeply appreciate the chance to testify briefly. My name is Kevin Campbell. I'm here today on behalf of the Oregon Association of Chiefs of Police and the Oregon State Sheriff's Association. I was not able to get to the hearing right at the beginning, but I understand there was a suggestion that the police chiefs and sheriffs were not being responsive on this issue, which is trying to find the right word to respond to that. I actually take this issue and my part in making sure our associations move forward deliberatively, very personally. So a suggestion that we were not responsive is deeply disappointing to me. On the record, I think it's posted. We spent hundreds of hours creating a policy framework. It is our preferred way of implementing policies around the state. And the reason for that is that in our roughly 180 police departments in the state, we have departments with several hundred officers. We have 30 agencies that have under 5 officers. And legislation is often the most difficult way to implement policy, because those agencies have to implement things differently based on their resources, their community needs. Some have to do things in partnerships where others can do them internally. And so what we tried to do, and what we spent hundreds of hours doing, was creating this policy framework. It's a policy framework that really went through best practice in this area in detail. So if you see it, it's not a small document. We not only created it, then we trained to it. We not only trained to it, we worked to make sure that agencies had the policies in place. I can tell you today, every sheriff's office in the state has this policy. I'm finishing today just to make sure, but I know that of the just around 120, there's over 100 agencies that have this in place. And Clackamas County was one of the leaders in moving forward with this. They, after all, were in the midst of this tragedy and really had to figure out what could we have done differently. Now, I know there's been characterizations about how they responded, but I'll tell you this. I was told today, well, they don't have a policy. That's not true. I said, was the sheriff ever asked? No. Well, that's unfair, and it's not true. And so I'm deeply disappointed about that characterization. If you read the introduction to the policy framework, you'll see that it's signed by both of our presidents of our association. It is something we've embraced completely. We've also done training for our detectives statewide. At the recent Child Abuse Summit, we brought an expert in to train specifically to this. We're in the process, we already got a grant, and we have a training committee dedicated just to officer-involved domestic violence that is right now scheduling additional trainings, and they're in the process of developing specific video training so that every agency in the state has access to training around the importance of officer-involved domestic violence. If you have the chance to read the President's 21st Century Policing Report that was developed under President Obama, then you'll know there were 7 pillars identified in that particular document. They dealt with a wide range of policing challenges. The first pillar being, how does law enforcement engage communities more effectively, thoughtfully, so that we have less tension based on the approach that law enforcement uses in communities? That pillar, along with the 7th pillar, are the 2 most important. The 7th pillar is officer wellness. And I think I've probably, in this committee before, mentioned that the challenges for police officers are immense. Unlike the military that deploys for periods of time and then is not deployed, law enforcement officers, because of the work they do, are really deployed at all times. The pressure, the stress, the things they see and have to deal with and have in their memories that don't go away are things that police agencies have to be better at dealing with. And this is a big emphasis within the Chiefs and Sheriffs Association. How do we keep officers well for a lifetime? If you look at our decertification numbers in the state, because you know Oregon is aggressive at making sure that officers who should not be in law enforcement don't remain there, we see that officers begin to burn out, and they do things that compromise their careers. It's all connected to officer wellness. And I mentioned before, one of the challenges we have in the state, and it's something we're going to have to address, is we have some of the lowest patrol strength in the state in anywhere in the nation. And I think I mentioned that the Oregon State Police troopers are 48th out of 49 states in terms of their patrol strength per 100,000, and that our city and county police are at the same range, at the bottom of the United States in terms of officers per 1,000. We have officers stretched thin. They don't have backup. They're being asked to do more and more to interact with society's greatest needs, whether it's mental health or it's domestic violence or other issues. And I know I'm talking on and on, so forgive me. But I do want to be clear The chiefs and sheriffs have not only engaged in a good faith process to address the concerns that were raised in this bill, I believe firmly and can stand here and say without question, we have gone above and beyond to ensure our agencies are actually responsive to this tragic, terrible incident, and to make sure it does not happen again in other departments. It is our leaders' great fear that they are going to have officers that are going to be in situations like this. It's a tragedy for families, for the officer, for the department, for the community, for everybody. And I'm just here to say we are committed to address this issue. We have worked hard to address this issue. We have plans to continue to address this issue, and we will be engaged in the future to ensure that we stay consistent with it. Forgive me for being so direct, but I am disappointed today at what I heard. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I am glad to answer any questions. Again, forgive me for
We
being
have a brief
so passionate.
time for any questions, but we have another.
Yes, I'm sorry. I apologize. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I look at your officer-involved domestic violence policy framework, 27-page document, and then I've also been looking at Washington State's, I don't think I'm looking at exactly their law as it was printed, but on their training website. I see a lot of similar language, So briefly, Kevin, if you can, talk to us about how closely, if at all, you've modeled yourself out of Washington, modeled yourself after Washington, if you're moving in that direction. Talk to me briefly.
And I need to start another hearing in just a few minutes, but please go ahead.
Great. Okay, Chair Barker and Representative Springer, the answer is we looked at numerous policies from around the United States. Washington was one of them, to make sure that we really were in front of best practice, which changes regularly in policing based on research and other factors. And that's why we tend to not want to put it in legislation where it becomes difficult to move and change. And so we looked at a number of them. And so it was a very involved process.
Okay, thank you. Okay, real quick, please.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell, and thank you so much to the family and to Representative Peluso and to the advocates for being here. I was a Clackamas County Commissioner at the time of the incident that you described, and I know that we had passionate conversations between the Board of Commissioners and Sheriff Roberts and his team around that time, and I have worked really hard on domestic violence prevention issues, and I'm going to continue to work hard on it, but I want to say, in fairness to, or not in fairness, but just out of respect for Sheriff Roberts, that I do believe personally, as a very strong advocate for survivors and for safety, that the Clackamas County team has worked really hard in response and developed a lot of framework and pro-safety response steps within the county as a result. And I salute and support the idea of working harder to do good work in the state, but I just want to be really clear that I think that in Clackamas, they actually have done a lot of work to try to address the issue. So, but thank you all for being here, and I know it's exceptionally painful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And, if you, just for a second, because I don't want to short the other people, we only have 2 brief periods today.
Again, Carla Peluso, House District 50. So, for the record, I support the sheriffs and the chiefs, and I have forever. I am a retired cop. I was a chief. The one thing that resonated with the policy that was being presented to us was that there was nothing concrete that required anything. It suggested things, it said these were things to do, but it put no requirement on an action item. Okay. That was the biggest frustration in trying to get our communications across. Again, I respect Kevin Campbell, I always have. I respect our chiefs and sheriffs. Like I said, I was one. And so I just wanted to make that clear. And if under the passion of my opening statement, perhaps reflected that not in the best way, but the whole point was that there were times when not every chief and every sheriff challenged us, but where there's some challenges that weren't justified from my perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, Representative.